Okay, so let's take a look at Knowers and Knowing, part 3. A man with only one theory is a lost man. So let's talk about reasonable knowledge. What is it for knowledge to be reasonable? Well, and you guys have already touched on this a little bit. There's two basic criteria that keep coming up generally. One is evidence and coherence. And when I did this activity with the other TOK group yesterday, funny enough, they came up with basically the same two things. Evidence, for a belief to be reasonable, for you to reasonably believe it, there should be some evidence for it, right? So imagine someone claims there are little green men running around on Mars. You could challenge them and say, well, you know what? Prove it, okay? And they answer to you, well, you can't prove that there isn't. This is often a claim, but this is a bad argument. That a person gives no positive evidence to support their belief and say, well, you can't prove that there isn't, is in fact something that is called a logical fallacy. And we're going to look at more into this when we do our reasoning unit, okay? The actual name for it in Latin is argumentium ad ignorantium. And you sound real smart when you start quoting Latin, even if you do it badly. And if you write about Latin in your writing, it often makes you sound smart as well. But basically it says, you can't prove something isn't true to show that it is. Okay? Or by claiming that you can't say something isn't true to prove that it is that fallacy. We should always look for evidence in favor of our beliefs, right? If I told you guys I had a dragon under my desk and you said, well, prove it, and I said, well, you can't prove that there isn't a dragon under my desk, most likely a lot of you would want to walk up and take a look behind my desk or just dismiss me right offhand and saying, there's no dragon back there. You wouldn't accept my claim, well, you can't prove that there isn't, as an actual claim. So the other part of this, though, is psychologists tend to say that we should watch out for something called confirmation bias. And you may have heard of this before, especially in your sciences class. Whereas that we only look at evidence to confirm our theories and often ignore evidence that does not support our theories or our beliefs. So for example, if you believe in astrology, if you really feel astrology helps and describes you, you will always notice when your horoscope is correct, and you will tend to ignore times when it doesn't seem like it's fitting you. Okay? And this is this concept of coherence. Coherence essentially just means to fit in or to cohere. So basically, that second criterion after evidence is, does this belief actually fit in with our understanding of everything else around it, right? If we look around the world and we see there's a white swan, there's a white swan, there's a white swan, there's a white swan, and all of a sudden we encounter a green and purple polka dotted swan, even though it's right in front of us, it doesn't seem to fit in, it doesn't seem to cohere with our knowledge of the world itself, that swans are generally white, and that color pattern probably doesn't occur naturally. So we examine our beliefs, but when we do that, okay, we have to be careful. It's like this analogy. If a sailor has to fix his boat while he's at sea, he can't take apart the entire boat. Otherwise, he will sink, right? So he must slowly rebuild the boat piece by piece, right? In order to actually stay afloat, he has to constantly rebuild parts of the boat at a time. He can't just take the entire boat apart while he's at sea. We use that analogy with doubt, right? You cannot all of a sudden just doubt every belief you have, because then you can't exist. Like, there's nothing you can do with all that, right? You have to examine each belief sort of individually within the realm of your other beliefs, okay? So that's that sort of incredible skepticism that I warned against last time. You can't just be this person that just says, you know what, I doubt everything, right? We have to be open to new ideas, but be skeptical at the same time, and I went over that a lot last class. Consider the claims of the man Uri Geller. Some of you may have heard of him. Uri Geller claims to be the world's most powerful paranormalist and is able to bend spoons using only his mind. He's been on a lot of talk shows, for example, talk shows in the past like Johnny Carson used to have him on, David Letterman, and stuff like that. Now, if this belief is true, that he can bend spoons with his mind, there should be evidence in support of it. You should be able to see that he can do this. You should also be able to claim that this power that he claims to have should fit in with our knowledge of the universe and physics and biology and everything else. So there's an organization in the United States called the James Randi Foundation, organized by a man named James Randi, who's a former magician. And he has what's called the $1 million challenge. And he will give someone $1 million United States cash who can demonstrate any paranormal, supernatural, or occult power or an event. This is a snippet from his website right there. Okay? And at the James Randi Foundation, anyone is willing to do this, including, he's claimed, challenge Uri Geller to do this. And no one has claimed the prize yet. Now, does that mean that James Randi has a good system? Does that mean Uri Geller does not have a good system? No, that's not what I'm proposing here. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. What I'm going to say is you should be critical in your analysis of those beliefs, right? We can criticize Uri Geller and say, you know what, and feel free to YouTube him on the weekend. You can see all his stuff. Uri Geller is someone we could criticize and look at the evidence and see if it fits in. We could do the same with James Randi. We could say, well, wait a minute, are you being fair in the way you're judging these people? So criticism and debunking and critical thinking is something you should apply to everything, okay? Okay, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. This, by the way, is one of my favorite philosophers, and he's not actually a philosopher. Richard Feynman is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Does anyone know his nickname? Does anyone know who Richard Feynman is? Has anyone ever heard of Richard Feynman? His nickname was the Great Explainer. Okay? If you like physics and you want to see someone explain it really, really well, he's passed away now. YouTube him and you'll find some amazing physics lectures. And he's just sitting in a chair talking about it, but the way he describes it is why he got that nickname. So who cares? Walks. A lot of you might be thinking that right now. What's the big deal? Let me believe what I want to believe and let, Johnny Hayseed believe what he wants to believe. Doesn't matter, right? Should it really matter what people believe? We can laugh at people with these crazy ideas. That's no big deal. You have the freedom to believe what you want. I think that is a right, that you can believe whatever the heck you want. But there could be an argument that some beliefs are more worthy of our respect than others. So people who believe in racism or sexism, maybe we don't hold those beliefs in the same regard as other beliefs. People who believe in what we would call crazy things, like that the weather patterns are changed by satellites and stuff like that. And maybe you believe that. So again, I don't want to put that sort of adjective on there. Is unworthy or worthier of others. Do beliefs matter, is essentially what I'm asking. Well, they are something that matters. Your beliefs define you. That's who you, when you're asked who are you as a person, you will actually start talking often about beliefs. Beliefs are a big part of who you are. But that's not the only reason they're important, okay? In a philosophical sense, you don't want to be what's called a second-hand self. Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So this idea of the second-hand self is someone who mindlessly just repeats the opinions of others. If you don't have your own beliefs, if they're not yours, then whose are they? You're not really following your own beliefs, you're just mimicking somebody else's. Now, I'm not saying your beliefs can't be influenced by other people, of course they can, but they should be yours. You should hold them. So at the same time, you should be ready to defend them. If they're your beliefs, you should be able to accept criticism and scrutiny on them. Now, again, it doesn't make sense to you to be constantly re-examining your belief like the sailor who's trying to rebuild his ship, okay? There's still something that's yours. But the second big reason why beliefs are important is beliefs affect actions. Now, here's what I mean. If there was an administrator in this school who believed in corporal punishment, in hitting students, in physically punishing students, that might affect his or her actions. And as a result, you might get a little like that next time you wear your hat to class or you pull out your cell phone. It's like the old joke. How many teachers does it take to push a kid down the stairs? None, he fell. So belief should and does influence action. And I put my remote down. Where did I put it? Oh, there it is. Okay. That was a joke, by the way, in case you guys... So here's some examples. Between the 15th and 17th century, approximately 500,000 people were burnt to death for the belief they'd committed the crime of witchcraft. They believed in witchcraft, and that crime was punished with death. Philip Morris was an executive for a cigarette company, and he believed that cigarettes were that cigarettes were no more addictive than gummy bears. Cigarettes aren't addictive. They're no more addictive than gummy bears. He believed that. In 1997, the leader of the Heaven's Gate cult persuaded his followers to believe that they should shed their human bodies and beam aboard a spaceship that was going to take them to a new realm. 39 people committed suicide that day, believing what he said was true. Belief does affect action. If they did not believe that, they wouldn't have gone through with the action of suicide. If he did not believe this, he would have not gone through the action of running the companies he did. If people didn't believe that, they would not have killed those people for the act of witchcraft. Belief shapes action. So again, we're back to the same problem, and we're never going to get to the answer to this, but how do we form this coherent picture of what knowledge is? Okay? Clearly, belief is a big part of it. Okay? The way we see our world is shaped by things like our history, culture, psychology. And we've been trying to figure out this knowledge problem through things like relativism, which we looked at last time, and certainty and belief and common sense. But we're still struggling. We're still trying to find a way to lay down a definition for knowledge. Knowledge is a small part of ignorance that we can arrange and classify. How do we define this? You're waiting for me to give that definition, right? You're waiting for me to define knowledge, maybe. And I will. We're getting there. But it's still not like when I present a definition to you, it's not the definition to you of knowledge. It is still an unanswered question as to what knowledge actually is. Okay, so let's look at that in a sort of a TOK way. Is truth an absolute? Okay, so I'm going to present three positions. Truth is absolute. Okay, which means whatever's true is true, it never changes, right? Like again, the world was always round, even if people didn't believe it was round, the truth is it was always round. That kind of position. Truth is relative, and this relates to what we talked about with relativism. And truth is subjective. This is more of an individualist approach. Okay, so if truth is relative, if there's an absolute truth, then what does that imply? So here's some implications of what would imply. Ethics is absolute. So the rules we live our life are never going to change. Ethics doesn't change. Killing is always going to be wrong. Depending on your belief system, the 10 Commandments are set in stone, etc. Ethics are absolute. Mathematics is absolute. The axioms of math are concrete, irrefutable. Math is set down. And with each of these I present, some of them might sound more reasonable to you than others. Like maybe this second one, you're like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Math isn't going to change. Natural science. Scientific research will lead to truths. History is an accumulation of data that is from observers from the past that is true. Arts. Experts will decide what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is an absolute that we can define. And logic, that it's pretty much laid down and irrefutable. Now the second position is that truth is relative, like we talked about before. Relative in this context to time and culture. Not necessarily individual, but relative to the time. So here in the 2014 era versus in the 1980s era or the 1900s era or the 1950s era, truth is different, and in the culture it's different. So here in the North American culture, truth is maybe different than in a different culture. So perception and emotion, which are influenced by culture, which we'll talk about, help determine truth. And language, which is part of our culture and our time, helps determine truth. So what does that imply? Well, it implies relative or situational ethics, which means the way we lead our lives ethically changes culture to culture and time frame to time frame. Now again, that might seem more reasonable to you. You might be thinking to yourself, yeah, actually, the ethics of the past are different than the ethics now, and the ethics in this culture might be different than the ethics that culture. So in a sense, maybe ethics is a relative thing. But when I looked at when you said absolute ethics, to me that also made sense. Which is it? Relative mathematics. Do the axioms change? Well, for example, Euclidean geometry, which is the geometry you've learned, is no longer applicable. Einstein kind of shattered that. And the multidimensional universe doesn't really, Euclidean geometry really works well on a flat plane, but not in the universe as we know it. What about natural science? Are scientific investigations tainted by the availability of instruments? The fact is most astrophysicists now think that the Earth is not, in fact, round, it's oval. And that maybe science is a changing paradigm based on relative sort of positions. Is history relative? The whole history is written by the victors is a stand that a lot of historians have probably presented to you. That we don't know what the Roman Empire was like from the perspective of a Roman slave because they didn't write those histories. Why not? Because they couldn't write. They didn't know how to write, right? Because they were slaves and they couldn't write. So, human sciences, right? So does that affect things in a relative position? Arts. So in the relative arts, beauty varies according to time and culture. So the modern female of 2000 in the sort of idealistic artistic position might be very different than the idealistic female model of, say, the 1900s. I think maybe if you've studied any sort of art, you see these women who would never be in an advertisement in today's modern world because they're maybe heavier than the models you'd see on television these days. But at the time, that was the standard. So is art relative? That's perhaps an argument that it is. Then the third position is subjective truth. That truth is solely dependent on the perception of the individual, okay? And that the individual's belief system influences their truth. So classic philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it make a sound? No. It's an open question, right? Does the sound exist independent of our ability to hear it? Let me throw a different one in there. Anyone know the game checkers? Okay? And there's rules for that game, right? Let's say checkers became unpopular. Let's say 100 years from now, nobody's played checkers since this time. And everyone's forgot the rules. Does checkers still exist? No. Anyone disagree? Okay, let's extend the argument even further. Let's say a catastrophic event occurs and the Earth is wiped out, including every checkerboard and every person that ever remembered checkers and ever remembered the rules. Does checkers still exist? No. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, oh, and I'm not giving you an answer. Don't expect an answer from me. That's not, I was just putting the question. So subjective ethics. So should we ought to behave, and that's a TOK term you're going to hear a lot from me, ought. The way we ought to behave is determined by each individual circumstance and individual belief system, and that weighs into what's right and wrong. Human sciences, every individual is different. It cannot be hard, fast ways about the way we behave. History takes place in the year I read about the history, suggesting that history itself is meaningless until the individual reads it and actually applies it. Arts, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there is no such thing as an expert in the arts because beauty is purely subjective. And logic. So our reasoning powers vary brain to brain. Everyone has their own kind of reason. These are kind of the big philosophical positions that you can start to put yourself in when you just start to think about what is true. These are the kinds of questions that you guys have been maybe taking for granted for 11 years. Well, that's true. Well, did you ever actually think about what that meant? When you said, this is what I know. And again, did you ever just think about what that meant? Man is a credulous animal and must believe something. In the absence of good grounds for belief, he will be satisfied with bad ones. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. Thank you for your wonderful attention again today. Let me just shut off my recording. All right, so